The ballroom of Crawford Manor had never looked more impressive. $500 million was about to change hands, and Ethan Crawford wanted every person in that room to feel the weight of it. Crystal chandeliers threw light across silk tablecloths, and the kind of flower arrangements that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Waiters in pressed white jackets moved between clusters of attorneys and executives with the quiet precision of chess pieces. The guest list read like a cross-section of everything that considered itself important in 3 countries. Senior partners from international law firms, infrastructure executives from the European continent, 2 university presidents who had been invited because Ethan liked their connections, and a scattering of financial press who had been carefully selected because Ethan liked what their publications said about him. At the center of all of it stood Ethan himself, tall, silver cuff-linked, wearing the particular smile of a man who had never once doubted his own importance, and had so far not been given sufficient reason to start. The contract sat on the table before him, 312 pages bound in ivory linen, written in English, French, and German, layered with the kind of legal language that took years of specialized training to decode. His guests were laughing. They were always laughing when Ethan was in the room. But tonight, one of them would laugh at something he had not planned, and the sound of it would echo in ways none of them expected. He scanned the room until he found her Maya Johnson, 28 years old. He had an idea. He did not know yet that it was the worst idea he had ever had. Maya had worked in Crawford Manor for 14 months. She arrived each morning before 6, left after the last dish was dried, and in all that time had never raised her voice, never complained, and never once given anyone in that house a reason to look at her twice. That was intentional. She was good at being invisible. The other staff had opinions about her. Maria, who managed the kitchen, thought Maya was slow because she rarely spoke. Derek, who handled the grounds, figured she was hiding something because no one that quiet was ever just quiet. The housekeeping supervisor, a sharp-faced woman named Carolyn, had said once just loud enough for Maya to hear that people like her always took longer to train. Maya had smiled. She had gone back to folding linens. That evening she had gone home and read 40 pages of a treatise on international commercial arbitration, made notes in the margins in 3 languages, and gone to sleep. Nobody in Crawford Manor knew she did this. Nobody asked. Ethan Crawford had built his fortune in logistics and infrastructure, the unglamorous backbone of global commerce. He was not cruel in the way that small men were cruel. He did not enjoy causing pain for its own sake. He was cruel the way very rich men sometimes became, through indifference, so complete it had calcified into certainty. He was certain that his instincts were better than other people's educations. He was certain that the people who served him existed at the correct level of the world. He was certain that money was not just a resource, but a verdict. You either had it or you didn't. And if you didn't, the reasons were probably your own fault. Tonight, with cameras running for the internal company archive and 24 of his most important business partners in the room, he was feeling particularly certain of everything. The event had been planned for 3 weeks. A merger between Crawford Logistics and a European infrastructure consortium, a deal that would expand Ethan's reach across 4 continents and make him, in the words of one financial publication, one of the most powerful private logistics operators in the world. The lead attorneys had been flown in from London and Berlin. A team of translators had spent 6 days reviewing the contract. Everything had been verified, or so everyone believed. Maya moved through the crowd with her tray, refilling glasses, collecting empty plates, making herself as small as the room would allow. She heard fragments of conversation as she moved. Exchange rates, liability clauses, subsidiary restructuring. She did not react to any of it. She had learned long ago that reacting to things in rooms like this only made people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people made things harder for her. It was near the end of the cocktail hour that she passed by the corner where 4 of the senior attorneys had clustered together with lowered voices and tight expressions. She was not trying to listen, but the room was quieter than it had been, and their words carried. One of them, the German lead, a man named Hoffman, was saying something about Clause 47. Another was shaking his head. A third was pointing at a page and saying the phrasing was ambiguous, that the English and German versions did not align, that they needed to flag it before the signing. Hoffman was dismissing the concern. They had been through the contract 4 times. There was no error. The other attorney was not satisfied, but he was also junior to Hoffman, and the hierarchy of the room was clear. Maya walked past. She set down her tray. She picked up 3 empty champagne flutes. She did not say a word, but she had heard everything, and something in her had gone very still, the way it always did, when she recognized a problem that everyone around her was choosing not to see. She had seen problems like this before. In another life, a life she no longer talked about, she had spent years learning to find exactly these kinds of fractures in exactly these kinds of documents. The error Hoffman was dismissing was not ambiguous. It was the kind of jurisdictional inconsistency that experienced attorneys missed precisely because they trusted the process too much, trusted the translators, trusted the reviewers, trusted the hierarchy of people who had said it was fine. She knew what it meant. She knew what it could cost. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, holding her tray, and then she moved on, because that was what she had learned to do in this house. To know things and to keep moving, because the knowing had never been enough to change anything here. That life felt far away tonight. She carried her tray back toward the kitchen, and she did not let herself think about it. There were things about Maya Johnson that the people of Crawford Manor did not know and had never thought to ask. They had her name on a timesheet, and her uniform on her body, and her silence as evidence of everything they assumed about her, and that was enough for them. It was not enough to be the truth. The truth was that Maya had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown University at the age of 22, with a dual degree in international law and linguistics. She had not coasted to that finish. She had worked through 4 years of full course loads and 2 part-time jobs, and the constant low-grade pressure of being one of a small number of black women in her program, the kind of pressure that does not announce itself as pressure but simply lives in the room with you, in the particular way other people look at you when you raise your hand or don't, when your grades come back and the professor seems surprised, when you are excellent and the room manages to treat it as mildly interesting rather than as the confirmation it should have been, all along, that you had always belonged there. She had been excellent anyway, not in spite of anything, just excellent, the way some people are when they find the thing their mind was made for. She spoke English, French, German, and Portuguese, with native or near-native fluency, and had working knowledge of Mandarin and Spanish. She had won a fellowship that sent her to Brussels, where she spent 18 months working with a team that specialized in cross-border commercial contract law, the narrow, complex field where language and legal jurisdiction and international trade all collided, where a single word in the wrong version of a document could shift millions of dollars of liability from one party to another. She had been, by every measure available to the institutions that tracked such things, exceptional. Then her mother got sick. It happened the way those things always happened, not all at once, but in stages, each one requiring more than the one before. First, it was appointments. Then, it was medications. Then it was the kind of care that couldn't be delegated to a stranger, that required someone who loved you to be present in the room. Maya had a younger brother still in school. She had no father in the picture. The math was not complicated. She came home. She put her career in a drawer, and she came home. And she spent 3 years being the person her mother needed her to be. When her mother died on a Tuesday in November, quietly, in a bed by the window with the morning light coming in, Maya sat in the hospital parking lot for a long time and tried to figure out what came next. The fellowship was gone. The firm she had been promised a position at had moved on. She had a gap in her resume that would require explanation, and she was not yet ready to explain it. She needed money. She needed time. She needed a job that asked nothing of her mind, so she could grieve without anyone watching. Crawford Manor had been hiring. 14 months later, she was still there. She had told herself it was temporary. She still told herself that, some nights. On other nights, she read her books and made her notes and tried not to count how long it had been. She kept a copy of the International Chamber of Commerce Uniform Rules for Contract Interpretation on her nightstand. She had underlined most of it twice. It was Ethan who spotted the book. He had come into the kitchen for something no one could remember later what it was, and Maya had been on a break, sitting at the small table near the back window, the thick red volume open in front of her, a pencil moving slowly across the margin of a page. He had stopped. He had stared. And then, because Ethan Crawford processed the world through a lens of performance, he had smiled the way you smile when you've been handed material. He said nothing. He filed it away. And when his guests arrived that evening, and the champagne was flowing and it was Roger Whitfield, a senior partner at one of the American investment firms, made a joke about the household staff. Ethan felt the idea surface, fully formed and gleaming. The party was at its height. 3 courses had been served. The attorneys had retreated to their corner. The executives were loosened by good wine and the pleasant anticipation of a deal well made. Ethan tapped his glass. The room quieted. He was good at this part. He knew how to hold a room. He said a few words about the significance of the evening, the scope of the deal, the shared vision that had brought them all together. People nodded. Then he paused, and his smile shifted into something that those who knew him recognized as the prelude to theater. He looked across the room until he found Maya, standing near the side wall with her hands folded in front of her. He raised his voice just slightly. He said her name. He told her to come to the center of the room. She came. She stood before 300 eyes with a stillness that was almost unnerving, and he held up the contract and said, in a tone that invited the room to be in on the joke, that if she could translate a few pages of this document, he would pay her 10 times her monthly salary on the spot. The room erupted. Someone said she probably couldn't read it. Someone else laughed at that. Ethan was still smiling. The cameras were running. Maya looked at the contract in his hands. She looked at Ethan's face. She looked at the room full of people waiting for the punchline she was supposed to be. Then she held out her hand. Ethan, surprised, placed the contract in it. She opened it. She did not look up at the crowd. She did not look at Ethan. She found the first page of operative text, and she began to read. What came out of her mouth was not hesitant. It was not stilted. It was not the sound of someone struggling. It was fluid, precise, and immediate English rendered into French without pause. The legal register maintained exactly. The subordinate clauses restructured the way a native speaker would structure them, not the way a translator who learned from textbooks would. She read 3 lines. She switched to German for the parallel clause without breaking rhythm. One of the German attorneys, a woman who had been smiling along with everyone else, stopped smiling. She tilted her head. She listened more carefully. Maya read another paragraph. The room was beginning to understand that something unexpected was happening. The laughter had not died all at once. It tapered, it hesitated, it looked around for permission to continue. No one gave it. Ethan was still holding his smile in place, but it had gone rigid at the edges, the way a structure holds its shape for a moment after the foundation shifts. Maya continued. She explained not just the words, but the legal meaning behind them, the distinction between binding arbitration and voluntary mediation in the context of the jurisdiction specified in the contract, the significance of the term force majeure as it applied differently under French and German commercial law, the way the indemnification clause in Section 4 interacted with the liability cap in Section 9 in a manner that could, under certain circumstances, create an unintended loophole. She said all of this the way someone says things they have thought about carefully and often, without performance, without display, just the clean movement of organized knowledge from one mind into a room. One of the senior attorneys, the American, a man named Garrett, who had 20 years of contract law behind him, had taken out his copy of the document and was following along. He was nodding slowly, the way a person nods when they are trying not to appear as surprised as they actually are. Professor Alan Shu, a legal academic who had been invited as an advisor, was gripping the arm of his chair. He had spent 12 years teaching commercial law at Columbia. He had reviewed the contract himself earlier in the week. He had found nothing wrong with it. He was not gripping the chair because he was bored. Maya turned a page. She kept reading. Several guests had pulled out their phones not to ignore the room, but to look up the provisions she was citing, to verify in real time what she was saying. A woman near the back, a corporate attorney from one of the European partner firms, confirmed something on her screen and looked up with an expression that had moved entirely past surprise into a quiet, professional recognition. Maya reached clause 47. She stopped. The silence was immediate and total. Not the silence that falls when something boring happens, but the deeper silence that arrives when a room full of intelligent people simultaneously senses that something has changed. It was the silence before a held breath, the silence of people recalculating. Ethan had moved closer without realizing it, his smile finally gone, replaced by something he rarely wore: attentiveness. Maya was looking at the page. Then she read it again. Then she turned to the parallel German section and read that. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened in the way that eyes sharpen when they have found exactly what they were looking for and wish they hadn't. She set the document down on the nearest table. She straightened. She said, calmly and without drama, that there was a problem. She said that Clause 47 contained a translation error of significant consequence. She said that the English version specified that the arbitration process would be governed by the laws of the state of New York, which was standard for American parties, but the German version— she paused and looked at Hoffman, who had gone slightly pale. The German version specified Frankfurt. She said that these two jurisdictions operated under fundamentally different arbitration frameworks, and that in the event of a dispute, the conflict between the two versions would generate a jurisdictional ambiguity that would have to be resolved in court, and that the court resolution could take years, could invalidate the arbitration clause entirely, and could expose the weaker contractual party, in this instance, one of the European subsidiaries, to liability under a framework it had not agreed to and could not have anticipated. She said that if the contract was signed tonight as written, there was a meaningful possibility that any future dispute would not be resolvable through the arbitration process both parties believed they were agreeing to. She said that this could cost one or more parties tens of millions of dollars. She said it all the way a doctor describes a diagnosis, not unkindly, not with satisfaction, simply as a thing that was true and needed to be understood. Hoffman had his copy of the contract out. His face had moved through several colors. The junior attorney who had tried to raise the concern earlier was looking at the table. Garrett had pulled up his phone and was already sending a message. Professor Shu had stood up from his chair. Two of the European partners were speaking quietly and urgently in German. The temperature of the room had completely changed. What had been a celebration was now something else, not a crisis, not yet, but the narrow ledge before one, where every person present was calculating exposure and trying to decide how afraid to be. Ethan stood at the center of it and said nothing. He was looking at Maya. She was looking at the contract, turning to another page, checking something, her face calm, her posture unchanged. She looked the same as she did when she was carrying a tray of champagne glasses. She looked exactly like herself. One of the European partners, a lean, silver-haired man named Dubois, who led the French consortium, and whose company stood to bear the greatest risk from the jurisdictional conflict, walked across the room with the measured deliberateness of someone who has already decided what he is going to do and sees no point in hurrying what is already certain. The room parted for him without his asking. He stood in front of Maya. He said, in French, "Who are you?" And Maya answered him, in French, without missing a beat, that she was the person who cleaned Mr. Crawford's house, and that she had noticed the discrepancy in the contract. Dubois looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Ethan and said, in English, that he would like Maya to join the emergency review session that would need to happen before any signing could proceed. Ethan said nothing. He looked at Maya. She was already looking at him, waiting, patient in the way she was, always patient with the quality of someone who has long since made peace with the distance between what is fair and what is. He nodded, and Maya closed the contract, set it carefully on the table, and followed the attorneys out of the room. The session took place in Ethan's private conference room, a long room off the main corridor with a mahogany table and a whiteboard and a view of the garden that no one looked at. 7 attorneys were present. Professor Shu had asked to attend and been invited. Dubois and his counterpart from the German consortium, a man named Becker, sat at one end. Garrett sat in the middle. Hoffman sat at the far end and had not spoken since the ballroom. Maya sat where she was told to sit, at the corner of the table, and when the document was opened to Clause 47, she was the first person anyone looked at. She walked them through it methodically. The error was not a simple typo. It was the kind of mistake that happened when translation was done in segments by different people who did not coordinate on jurisdictional language, and who perhaps assumed the other sections had been verified by someone else in the chain. That assumption, passed along like a relay baton that no one had actually held for long enough, had produced a document that looked complete from the outside and contained a structural fault at its core. She explained the precise legal consequence of the conflict between the two versions. She explained that the way to resolve it was not simply to pick one jurisdiction, but to add a governing law hierarchy clause, a standard provision in cross-border contracts that specified which version would control the event of inconsistency, and that the parties needed to agree on that hierarchy now, before signing, because their preferences might differ and those differences mattered. She said there were 3 standard approaches, and explained the implications of each. The first prioritized the contract language of the governing party in the primary transaction, which benefited Crawford's position. The second established a neutral third-party jurisdiction, which was slower to resolve but produced more predictable outcomes. The third used an ICC arbitration framework that bypassed jurisdictional conflict entirely at the cost of some procedural flexibility. She laid out the trade-offs. She answered questions. When Becker pushed back on one of her interpretations, she cited the specific ICC rule that supported her position and offered to find the exact provision if he wanted to see the text. He said that would not be necessary. His expression said he had already conceded. Hoffman had not spoken since they sat down. His copy of the contract was open in front of him, and he was reading Clause 47 again, the way a person reads something they have read many times before, but are only now actually seeing. The session lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, there was a solution. The contract would be amended. The signing would be rescheduled for the following morning, after the revised language had been reviewed by all parties' counsel. The deal was intact. The $500 million was still on the table. The catastrophe had been averted by a woman whose job title, according to the official Crawford Manor staffing records, was household attendant. Ethan sat in his chair at the edge of the room and watched Maya explain things to the most expensive attorneys in the building, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. It was not quite shame. Not yet. It was its precursor, the slow, uncomfortable recognition that you have been operating on assumptions that the world has just declined to confirm. After the session ended, and the attorneys dispersed to their rooms, and Dubois had shaken Maya's hand with the particular gravity of a man who understood what he owed her, Ethan asked her to stay. They were the last 2 people in the conference room. The whiteboard still had her diagram on it. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. The room was quieter than the manor usually was. All the machinery of the event stripped away, and in that quiet he felt, more acutely than he had in many years, the specific discomfort of a man confronting the distance between who he has believed himself to be and what his actions have revealed. He asked her, without the tone he usually used to talk to her, without the casual dismissiveness of a man who had never once considered that she might be worth more attention, he asked her to tell him the truth about herself. Maya sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table, the same way she had stood in the ballroom when he'd called her out. She told him. She did not tell it dramatically. She did not want his guilt. She told it the way she had come to think of it, as a sequence of events, most of them unchosen. She told him about Georgetown. She told him about Brussels. She told him about her mother. She told him about the calculation she had made, the career she had set down, the grief that had taken longer than she expected, and the crawling, incremental process of trying to rebuild a life when you have been away from the world you were trained for long enough that the world has partially forgotten you were ever there. She told him she had come to Crawford Manor because she needed something manageable, something that would not require her to perform competence while she was still putting herself back together. She told him she had not planned to stay this long. She told him she was not angry with him for what had happened tonight, but that she wanted him to understand something. He leaned forward slightly. She said that what he had done, calling her to the center of that room, making her an object of entertainment, assuming that her uniform told the full story of her mind, was not exceptional. She said that people like him did things like this to people like her all the time, in 100 small ways and in large ones, and that most of the time, no one was in a position to do what she had done tonight. And so the cruelty went unwitnessed, and the assumption went unchallenged, and everybody walked away believing the thing they already believed. She paused. She said she hoped he would think about that, not to punish himself with it, but to actually let it change something in how he moved through the world. Because guilt that didn't change behavior was just an emotion people used to feel better about themselves without doing the harder work. Then she stood up, thanked him for listening, and said she needed to finish clearing the ballroom. He let her go. He sat alone in the conference room for a long time after that. The offer came the next morning. Dubois made it himself, in writing, on his company's letterhead, an advisory position with his consortium's legal affairs division, a salary that made Maya's current monthly wage look like a rounding error, and a title that reflected the kind of work she was actually capable of doing. He had called Georgetown the night before. He had called a former colleague at the International Chamber of Commerce. He had made a few other calls, and what he had learned had only confirmed what the conference room had already shown him. He delivered the offer letter to Maya personally, in the kitchen, before the staff breakfast, holding it out with both hands in the way that certain Europeans do when they want to signal that something is being given with genuine respect. Maya read it. She read it twice. She set it on the counter beside the coffee pot, and she said she would need a day to think. Ethan heard about the offer before noon. He heard about it from 3 different people, each one watching him with the particular attentiveness of people who want to see how the powerful respond when they are outmaneuvered. He did not respond the way they might have predicted. He did not minimize the offer or redirect attention or behave as though the events of the previous evening had been someone else's problem. He thought about the conference room. He thought about Maya's diagram on the whiteboard. He thought about the moment she had stopped at clause 47 and the way she had set the document down with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago accepted that she was going to have to carry things no one would thank her for. He thought about the book he had seen her reading at the kitchen table, the one he had laughed at when he'd filed it away as material for a joke. He did not feel clever about that anymore. That afternoon, he gathered the full staff of Crawford Manor, not just the household attendants, but the grounds crew, the kitchen, the drivers, the maintenance team. He stood in the main corridor, and he said what he had spent the morning finding words for. He said that he had used his position the previous evening to humiliate a member of his household in front of an audience, and that this had been wrong, and that it did not matter that the evening had turned out differently than he intended, because his intention had been to embarrass her, and he needed to say that plainly and in front of witnesses. He said that he had operated for a long time on the belief that the people who worked for him were defined by what they did for him, and that Maya had shown him in a single evening how profoundly, how arrogantly wrong that belief could be. He did not dress the apology in promises about the future, because he had learned enough in the last 18 hours to understand that announced intentions are not the same as changed behavior, and that the people standing in this corridor had heard enough announced intentions in their lives to know the difference between a man who was performing accountability and a man who was trying to actually hold it. He said he was sorry. He said it without qualification. He said he understood if that was not enough. He meant it. And most of the people in the room could tell that he meant it, which was itself its own kind of thing. The small shock of sincerity in a house where polish had always been required and sincerity had always been optional. The room was very quiet. Maya stood at the back near the kitchen entrance. She had her arms crossed loosely, not defensively, the way someone stands when they are listening carefully to something they already know. When Ethan finished, she waited to make sure he was done. Then she said, the thing she had been carrying since the previous night, the thing she had wanted to say in the ballroom, but had not, because the ballroom had not been the right place, and the conference room had not been the right place. But here, in the plain corridor of an ordinary morning, surrounded by the people who washed Ethan Crawford's floors and maintained his hedges and cooked his meals here, felt close enough. She said that the problem was not that he had underestimated her. She said she had spent enough of her life being underestimated that she had stopped taking it personally. She said the problem was that he underestimated everyone in the room. She said that every person standing in that corridor had a life outside the walls of this house, a history, a set of capacities that went far beyond what their job descriptions required of them, and that treating them as scenery, as background, as the quiet machinery that kept his comfort running was not just wrong to her, it was wrong to all of them. She looked around the room when she said it. She was not speaking to Ethan anymore. She was speaking to the people she had worked beside for 14 months, the people who had sometimes looked down at her and sometimes through her and sometimes, late in the evening when the guests were gone, had sat with her in the kitchen and told her things they didn't tell the people upstairs. She was speaking for all of them, and they knew it. And the room was still in the way that rooms are still when something true has been said inside them. She accepted Dubois' offer 3 days later. She gave Ethan 2 weeks' notice, which he did not ask for, but which she gave anyway, because that was how she did things. In those 2 weeks, she trained the person who would take her position in the house. She left detailed notes on every regular task, and she said goodbye to each member of the staff individually, by name, in the way that mattered. On her last day, Carolyn, the sharp-faced housekeeping supervisor, who had once said Maya was slow, found her in the hallway and said, stiffly, but without pretense, that she had been wrong about her. Maya said she appreciated that. They did not hug, but they stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at each other like people who have shared the same walls for a long time, and that was something. The story got out. It always does. Someone who had been at the party told someone, and that someone told someone else. And within a few weeks, the essential shape of the evening, the contract, the translation, the Clause 47, the maid who had saved a $500 million deal and been offered a job in the same hour, was circulating in the particular way that stories circulate when they contain enough injustice and enough satisfaction to make people want to pass them along. Several publications reached out to Maya. She declined most of them. She gave one short interview in which she said very little about Ethan, and a great deal about the structural conditions that allowed people with significant qualifications to go invisible in professional settings when their circumstances forced them outside the crisis to go. Expected path. She said that she was not exceptional. She said it carefully, meaning not that her abilities were ordinary, but that her situation was not unusual, that there were people with comparable training and comparable histories doing work that was far below their capacity all over the country, not because they lacked ambition, but because ambition alone had never been sufficient to carry a person through every obstacle the world placed in front of them. She said she hoped that the story, if it was going to be told, would be told in a way that pointed at that, rather than treating her as a miraculous exception to a rule that should not have existed in the first place. Ethan read the interview. He read it more than once. He had already, in the weeks since the party, begun a process of internal review at his company, not a dramatic public gesture, but a genuine reckoning with the way hiring worked, the way promotions were decided, the assumptions embedded in the systems he had built over 20 years. He brought in consultants, not the kind whose job it was to produce reports that looked good and changed nothing, but the kind who asked difficult questions and then stayed long enough to see if the answers were implemented. He sat through sessions with his own HR leadership that were uncomfortable in the specific way that sessions are uncomfortable when the data being presented about the organization you built reflects back a picture of yourself you would have rejected a year ago. He looked at the demographics of his senior leadership team, and at the pathways that had produced them, and at the people who had not made it through those pathways, and he asked his team to help him understand what had happened at each point of attrition and why. Some of what they found had explanations. Some of it did not. He launched a program modest at first, 10 slots in the first year, with a commitment to expand it if the model worked, that offered paid training and mentorship to candidates from non-traditional backgrounds who had been displaced from their professional paths by circumstances outside their control. Caregiving responsibilities, medical crises, economic shocks, the ordinary emergencies that life used to remove talented people from the trajectories the world had decided, were the only acceptable routes to value. He named the program after no one. He did not want it to be about him. He wanted it to be about the people it was for. Some of the people at the party had watched Maya's trajectory with admiration, some with embarrassment. A few had reached out to apologize, privately, in the way people apologize when they suspect the record will eventually be checked. Roger Whitfield, who had made the original joke about the household staff, sent a very long email that Maya read once and did not reply to. She bore him no specific ill will. She simply did not have anything to say that would serve either of them. She had more interesting things to do. The Dubois Consortium's legal affairs work was complicated and varied, and engaged every part of her mind in a way that felt, in the first weeks, almost physical, the sensation of a muscle finally being used after a long period of disuse, mildly painful at first and then, gradually, exactly right. She found an apartment she liked, in a neighborhood she had wanted to live in for years. She brought her books out of storage and put them on proper shelves. She bought a new notebook and began filling it with ideas she had been saving up for a long time. She called her brother on Sunday evenings, and sometimes they talked about their mother, and sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, and this too felt like something settling into its right place. She did not think often about Crawford Manor. When she did, it was without bitterness and without nostalgia, simply as a place she had passed through, like a long corridor that had taken longer than expected, and at the end of which she had arrived somewhere that made sense. 9 months after the evening with the contract, there was an international trade conference in Geneva. Maya attended as a representative of the Dubois Consortium, which had given her a portfolio that included cross-border dispute resolution and contract architecture across 4 jurisdictions. She was on a panel. She presented research she had been developing for 6 months, a paper on jurisdictional conflict resolution in multilingual commercial contracts, work that had grown directly from the experience of Clause 47 and the questions it had opened in her about how often similar errors went uncaught, how many transactions moved forward on the strength of documents that had never been properly verified across their parallel versions. The paper had been accepted by a commercial law journal before the conference. 2 of the senior attorneys from the conference circuit had cited it in their own recent work. She had not told anyone about the journal acceptance. She had written it in the same way she had always done her best work for its own sake, because the problem was interesting, and the field was better with the question asked, and for no other reason. She presented the paper in Geneva with the same quality of attention she had brought to a conference room in Crawford Manor, the same methodical precision, the same willingness to say the complicated thing plainly. The panel went well. Afterward, in the large atrium, where attendees gathered for coffee and handshakes and the slow commerce of professional connection, she was moving through a cluster of people when she heard her name. She turned. Ethan Crawford was standing 6 feet away. He looked different from how he had looked in his ballroom, not smaller exactly, but differently proportioned, as though he had shed some quantity of weight that had previously read as size. He was at the conference as a keynote participant, she would later learn, speaking on the future of global logistics infrastructure. He was as important as he had ever been. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. He walked toward her. He did not say her name with the voice of a man calling his household attendant to the center of a room. He extended his hand. She took it. They shook hands, once, firmly, in full view of 200 people who had no particular reason to understand what they were witnessing. He said it was good to see her. She said the same. They stood together for a moment in the busy atrium, 2 people who had met in one configuration and were meeting now in another, and there was nothing between them now but the ordinary respect owed between 2 professionals who understood the value of what the other had built. He said he had read her panel paper. He said it was excellent. She thanked him. He asked if she was free for a few minutes after the session, if she would be willing to have a conversation about some of the jurisdictional questions she had raised. She said she would look at her schedule. She said she would send his office a note. He nodded. He said thank you. And she believed him. Not because people always mean the things they say, but because she had been in the room when he had understood something about himself that was difficult to understand, and she had watched him sit with it rather than explain it away. And whatever he had done with it afterward was not nothing. She did not need it to be redemption. She only needed it to be real. And this, the handshake, the atrium, the Geneva light coming through the glass overhead, two people meeting as equals on ground, that neither of them owned this, felt real enough. She walked back to her session. She had 3 more meetings that afternoon, and a dinner with the consortium's legal team, and a document to review before morning. Her work was waiting. It was always waiting. She was glad for that now, in a way that had taken a long time to arrive at, glad for the weight of it, the substance of it, the particular satisfaction of being exactly as capable as she had always known herself to be, and finally being in a place where that capability had somewhere to go. She sat down. She opened her notebook. She found the page where she had written her notes on the panel paper, and she added a line she had thought of that morning and not yet found a place for. She wrote it down. She underlined it once. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window at the city below, the old streets and the distant water, and the thin light of a late afternoon that was already tilting toward evening, all of it going on as it always did, indifferent and accommodating, making room, as it always eventually does, for the people who refuse to stop arriving. There is something the world consistently underestimates. Not intelligence, not training, not even resilience, though all of these are real, and all of them matter. It is the patience of the person who knows what they are worth and is willing to wait, in silence if necessary, in invisibility if required, for the moment when the room is finally ready to see them. Maya Johnson had been patient for a long time. She had done her waiting in service corridors and kitchen tables, and the margins of books that no one asked about. She had carried her knowledge the way you carry something valuable in a place where she had stayed in a role that diminished her, not because she lacked the ability to leave, but because she was still finding her footing in a world that had shifted beneath her while she had been doing the necessary work of keeping someone she loved alive. She had earned her patience by surviving everything that had made it necessary. And when the room had asked for a punchline, she had given it an answer instead. Not to prove something, not to perform, simply because the problem was there and she could solve it. And that, in the end, was the only reason that had ever mattered. The people who had laughed in the ballroom went on with their lives. Some of them changed, some of them didn't. Most of them fell somewhere in the complicated middle, where most change actually lives a little more careful, a little less automatic, a little more aware of the distance between a job title and a person, though perhaps not always able to act on that awareness in the moment it counts. That is the truth of it. Not everyone who witnessed what happened that night became a better person because of it, but some did. And the ones who did would carry it differently than they had carried things before. A small adjustment in the angle of their assumptions, a slight loosening of the certainty that the world they saw was the only world there was. Small adjustments, maintained over time, are what change is made of. Maya knew this. She had been the product of small adjustments herself, small choices, small disciplines, small acts of faith in a future that had not yet arrived. She had made those choices in the dark, for years, with no audience and no reward. She had made them because they were hers to make, and because the alternative was to stop believing she was worth the making. She never stopped believing that, not once, and in the end, that was the whole story.